Teaching is like giving a child wings to fly with their dreams. So as I mentioned, like education was what saved me. What I meant by this is that I was a lost young adolescent living in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city of New York.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third episode of Positionality Podcast. My name is Rinzin Sonam. Before we get started, I want to give a huge shout out to Tenzin Chiang for helping in the background with this podcast. So today's topic is about the importance of Tibetan-based learning center in Tibetan community. We have Chime Dolma as our guest today. If you guys don't know who Chime is, she is a history teacher at an elite private school in New York City. She's also the co-founder of YindaYin Coaching. Now, YindaYin is a nonprofit learning centers in Queens, New York. They provide tutoring classes in various subjects, including Tibetan, English, Chinese, math, and SATs. On top of the classes offered, YindaYin provides career guidance to their students through their mentorship program, as well as college application classes, workshops, and leadership programs to all ages. Chime is the definition of what a strong, educated Tibetan woman is. We will talk about that a little more towards the end. But I'm actually super excited to have you again, Chimila. So to tell you a little bit about Chime's character, before we get started, we actually did a full interview last week, but due to some technical issues, we could not publish it. But Chimila offered to do the whole interview again because she didn't want our effort to go to waste. So this kind of gives you a little bit idea of the kind of person Chimila is. So let's get started with the first question. To start us off, Chimila, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey leading up to YindaYin coaching?
Absolutely. Thank you, Rinzin, for giving me this wonderful opportunity. I feel so inspired and feel a sense of pride whenever I see initiatives like this, which are started by young people. And as you know, as an educator, I dedicate my service and time and energy to basically serve young people. And so whenever I see things that are started by young people, it makes me super happy. And I just wanted to thank you and Chang for this platform. So just to give you a little background about myself, I was born in Tibet as an illiterate yak herder, and I left Tibet to India in pursuit of education. And after a short time in India, I immigrated to the US as an adolescent, and I completed my high school and college and graduate school in the US. Mm-hmm. I'm currently working as an educator, as you mentioned, and I have been in this education arena for over a decade now. Wow. And I think, yes, did you want me to talk about YindaYin coaching?
Yeah, can you just talk a little bit about maybe your journey leading up to YindaYin and provide just a little bit of background about YindaYin?
For sure. So I started this learning center, this nonprofit organization for primarily immigrants back in 2015 with a colleague of mine whose name is Tashi Tenzin. My colleague and I shared a similar passion, which was to envision ways to connect and build bridges between different communities. We initially did not know each other. I met him at a conference back in 2012 in Washington, D.C., where I had given a talk on gender inequality in Tibetan nomadic communities, specifically on Tibetan Plateau. And he came up to me and said that he had read an article about me when he was back in Tibet. My colleague had gone through the Chinese education system and managed to get a degree in mathematics at one of the best Chinese universities. So when I met him, he shared with me that he had read this article on a website platform about my achievements back in 2007, about my personal and academic achievements. And he felt a sense of pride after reading the news article because at the time, he was fed misinformation about Tibetan students, such as things like how Tibetan students are inherently inferior or less academically gifted back in China.
Mhm.
after reading an article where I was basically awarded by the mayor of New York City at the time, Michael Bloomberg, for my personal and academic achievements, he felt a sense of pride, and he felt that the narrative that he was receiving at the time was questionable.
Mhm.
And he wanted to sort of change that narrative and say, hey, there are actually capable Tibetan students in diaspora community. And he basically felt like what he was getting at the time was not necessarily accurate information,
Mhm.
which also speaks to the power of one's personal story and the impact it can have on on an individual. So that's sort of how he had a chance to sort of get to know about me. And so he shared that story with me, and I was somewhat moved because, again, he was on a different continent at the time, and I was in New York City trying to learn English at the time. And somehow that little article connected us. And so then we, of course, shared our passion for education, exchanged our ideas and experiences. From there, we started to have many more conversations about how we can contribute something positive towards our Tibetan community in particular. And at the time, obviously, I had more experience with the Tibetans in New York City. So we, talked about how a lot of the recent Tibetan immigrants are not necessarily they do not necessarily have access to enough resources. And so we thought about creating online platforms where children can, listen to bedtime stories and such. And from there, we started to have discussions about how we can provide quality education to the Tibetan community. And that's how we led to the creation of YindaYin coaching.
Mhm. Um, so it kind of goes to show the danger of single storytelling, of how even the U.S. government perceive Tibetans as less educated. So that's really powerful. I know you said you were a yak herder when you were in Tibet. So at what age did you move to the U.S.?
So I think back in, so I left when I was 12 or 13, and I was about 14 when I moved to the US.
Okay, and then you studied up till high school here, and then college. I know you worked your butt off, right? Can you talk a little bit about that part?
Sure. So initially, when I came to the States, obviously, just like for any new arrival, it was very difficult to get accustomed to a new set of norms, new culture, new language, new education system. And it was very daunting, and it was very challenging, obviously. And the fact that I wasn't educated as a young child, I had to sort of start from scratch. And that made it even more difficult. And then, in addition to that, there's the language barrier. So I went to a high school that was primarily created for recent immigrants. So all of my classmates were students who had been in the US for less than 2 years. So essentially, we were using body language to communicate with one another for the first like 6 months or so. And obviously, in New York City, there is this requirement from the state to pass all, I think, 5 regions at the regions test at the time, and it was difficult for a lot of my classmates because you had to pass all the main subjects, including English. And many of us were sort of learning English for the first time, didn't necessarily have a normal conventional education, I should say schooling. So it was challenging. However, I had some really incredible teachers in my life who just helped me get through this challenge. And I was able to not only learn English really quickly, but also pass all the Regents tests with actually pretty high score, not to brag about myself, but and so I was able to complete high school in 4 years and eventually got into Middlebury College with a full scholarship from Gates and Melinda Foundation, which basically paid for my education.
Okay. That's quite impressive. So I actually also moved here when I was 12 years old, and I went to a pretty predominantly white school, and I think I was actually one of the only Asian kid in middle school and high school, and it was very difficult. It was not only the shock of the classroom, but also not seeing people like you. Um, so I think it's important to talk about these stuff because it's a real experience that a lot of immigrants face. So thank you for sharing that, Jimmy. So why is a Tibetan-based learning center important when there are other learning centers or opportunities provided in New York City?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And it has a lot to do with my own personal upbringing experience. So, as I mentioned, because of all the difficulties and barriers that I experienced, I also witnessed a lot of other Tibetans go through similar challenges. And as you know, Tibetans are one of the newest groups of immigrants. And as I mentioned earlier, immigrants have to uproot and start from scratch. That means they have to get accustomed to a new set of norms, culture, language, and systems. That means they have to build a community that sort of meets their own needs. So for the last 20 plus years or so, the older generation of Tibetans had to simply survive under dire conditions, working long hours for extreme low wages under terrible conditions. So now it is really up to the younger generation, obviously along with the guidance from the older generation, to create resources and services that best serve our Tibetan community as well as the wider community of immigrants. So personally, as I mentioned earlier, education was what saved me from a broken home and let me find a space and agency over my own life. Therefore, I started YindaYin coaching with my team to extend that service for other immigrants and refugee children in order to equip them with the necessary skills to lead a meaningful and independent life.
Very well. You touched a little bit on this, but there are many ways you can help the immigrant community in Queens, New York, but you specifically chose teaching as the method. Why is that?
Great question. I love it. Yeah. So this is how I see it, right? Teaching is like giving a child wings to fly with their dreams. So as I mentioned, like education was what saved me. What I meant by this is that I was a lost young adolescent living in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city of New York with very little support system at home. And I was completely bewildered by seemingly alienating American culture. Uh, and the only people that I had in my life at the time were my teachers, who were my friends, my mentors, and confidants. So I turned to them for help, and they were the people who embraced me with an open arm and showed me a variety of ways or paths to find a journey that is satisfying for myself. And eventually, with their guidance and mentorship, I was able to find a path that was both professionally and personally satisfying. So I would say that, you know, my teachers had played an important role in my life, and my teachers were the ones who trusted me the most, and they were the ones who trusted my judgment. And this was what enabled me to fly with my wings. And so I think for me, it was important to give back what I had received, which was that trust, which was that way of giving the folks who maybe are wingless at the moment the wings that they need to fly. And that usually comes with trust.
Were you inspired because of how your teachers have cared for you, or was there something else that inspired you to work so hard at such a young age and have such good head on your shoulder?
Yeah, I think I use the word trust very loosely. I think it boils down to trust. Obviously, there are many aspects that add to the art of teaching, right? Teaching is not necessarily just standing up in a classroom and transmitting knowledge. Obviously, teaching can come in different forms, right? So teaching is about not just knowing the content of what you're teaching, but really it's an art, right? It's an art of how you connect with other human beings, other individuals, other young people. And I think my teachers were incredibly gifted and artistically gifted in that respect because they knew how to connect with someone who couldn't even speak the language. And they learned how to empower that individual who was completely lost in this new alienating culture. Uh, and yet they were able to bring me out of my comfort zone, my shell, and speak out and talk about myself. So I think that is truly an art. And that is something that I try to do and aspire to do, although I'm not always successful, but that is something that I try to do for my students. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it really is about trust because as a child, I always had my own set of insecurities, right? Namely, the language barrier. I could not express myself. So every single time I started speaking, I thought nobody would understand me or that my English was broken and therefore I can't really speak what I have in my head. And yet my teachers, even though I spoke imperfect English, they were amazed by what I had to say. And they, basically said what I had to say was important. And they earned my trust and I started speaking. And that's how I sort of came out of my shell.
Wow, bless your teachers. So, you said teaching is what worked for you, but I remember a quote, Mate Masio. I'm probably not saying it right, but he's the president of International Campaign for Tibet. He once said, "You can choose whatever career you want and can be a leader in that profession and help Tibetans and Tibet in that way and your community." And I think that is such an important quote to hear because for me, it really changed the way I looked at certain things. I used to think the only way to get involved in the Tibetan community is to work directly with Tibetan community, but I don't. After hearing that quote, I think that's not the case. You can give back in whatever profession you are in and be a leader in that profession.
Absolutely. I agree with you completely.
But that aside, being a Tibetan woman unfortunately comes with, I'm sure, many disadvantages and in the U.S. and honestly a little bit even in our Tibetan community. Jimla, you're also a leader in the Tibetan community, impacting multiple kids and families' lives for the better. Having heard your story, you are what I describe as a strong, educated, and compassionate Tibetan woman. For some people, that is really scary because they're not used to Tibetan women creating change and being a leader. That's really scary to them. And some people can't adapt or they don't do well with changes. What has your experience been like being a Tibetan woman, and what challenges has that brought you up in trying to create change? And a follow-up question after that would be, what role has the center played for immigrants, women in Queens, New York?
These are all really important questions, but before I answer these questions, I do want to comment on what you said about how you could be a leader in every arena, which I think is super important because right now I'm speaking about, as a leader in education. And I think the Tibetan community, especially in diaspora communities, that is Tibetan communities in Europe, Canada, US, right? There are so many ways that we could be the leaders, right? So many different avenues, and teaching doesn't have to be the only way. I am seeing many more incredibly resilient, hardworking Tibetans in New York City who are starting restaurants everywhere, right? These are different ways to contribute to the thriving culture, thriving community in New York City, since I know New York City the best. And I'm seeing chefs' stories in New York Times or other news articles, and that makes me happy because we need every Tibetan to take on some sort of a leadership role to literally show the world that we have a unique culture, and it could be useful to other people, right? So I think people can be creative in their own ways to become leaders in our community. So whether that's in activism or teaching or in the food industry, right? And we have now a lot of young people who are starting different organizations where they're helping out the most vulnerable populations, like social services. These are all great ways to contribute to our society for sure. In terms of me being a Tibetan female leader in our community and my role at YindaYin coaching. So as you know, I'm currently wearing the hat of obviously the president of the organization. And the interesting fact is that my co-founder is actually male. And he's someone who's actually quite unique in that way because even though he grew up in Tibet and went through the Chinese education system, he's someone who's very progressive when it comes to gender equality. And majority of the other teachers at YindaYin coaching are female, with the exception of one lead teacher and a few high school volunteers. Our students also tend to be mostly female students. And I don't know what to make of it. However, I think I mentioned this before. I heard in a TED Talk about how immigrant men from conservative backgrounds tend to have harder time adapting to a new culture. And I'm seeing evidence for this claim in our community. So I continue to witness and also observe a strong sense of patriarchy everywhere, more visibly, or I should say in less subtle ways in our Tibetan community. And I think it is due to lack of education and awareness. Women are still subject to roles that are limited to childbearing, house chores, and sometimes are expected to submit to their husbands. Obviously, this practice varies depending on one's education attainment and upbringing, but I am seeing, this sort of what I would say patriarchal norms more visibly in our communities. And I hope that will change with time and awareness. In terms of how gender has played a role at our center, when we plan our curriculum or when we ask folks to join us on our planning, we're always paying close attention to the gender dynamics, obviously. We try to ensure that we have, guest speakers who could be good role models for our boys, because as I mentioned, we have predominantly female students, and we want to make sure that the boys are also having people that they can look up to. And as you already know, the teaching profession is sort of dominated by female in this country. And that's an interesting trend. Back in before the 1970s, teaching was a male profession. And now the trend has shifted. And that's an interesting, I think, shift in our system. And I think teaching profession is one of the professions that is quite undervalued in this country in terms of pay, right? And the way people sort of look at teaching. One of my friends actually had this interesting quote. It says, I became a teacher because of the fame and reputation. And I think it's such a oxymoronic statement because it's quite the contrary to that statement, because teachers are the ones who are constantly bashed about their inability to educate the new youth. They are given the responsibility to essentially like take care of the child holistically, which I think it should be an aspiration. But I think in order to raise a child, you know, as the famous saying goes, it takes a village. The responsibility really falls on everybody, not just the teachers themselves, right? Because we have to have a system that allows the best to also serve our youth. And if we have a system that doesn't allow the best to come into the teaching profession, then it's not going to do anyone justice. So that's an interesting thing to, I guess, to think about, right? How the teaching profession has changed in terms of its gender roles, and how we continue to sort of see teaching profession. And I hope that, you know, more people will sort of pay attention to that and figure out ways to make maybe I don't know, maybe think about how we could make the teaching profession a little more supported, right? And when I say teaching profession, I'm talking about specifically in this country, because the teaching profession in Singapore, let's say, is very different. So I think there are systems that we need to continue to look at in order to improve the teaching profession in this country.
So I kind of want to go back onto the part about how your gender has played a role in, or any challenges you've faced.
Yeah, so personally, as I mentioned, we still live in a very predominantly male-driven sort of community. And you can look at the different associations and organizations and see who sort of runs these different organizations. And in terms of like my own upbringing, I often challenged the status quo, and I think I will continue to challenge the status quo, because if we don't challenge the status quo, it's going to continue to perpetuate, and that inequality, especially gender inequality, will persist.
I remember talking to another Tibetan woman. She's well known. I won't mention her name because she didn't give permission to say her name, but I'll just tell a general like overview of the story. So she is well known in our community. She has her own organization, and she was in India one day, and they were discussing policy or something like that. And she was with a group of male, and they were all discussing. And then when it came time for dinner, all the women got up. Well, I'm sorry, to give you context, she's from the US, and she went back to India to talk with a couple of people about some kind of policy. And when it came dinner time, all the women got up and they left to make dinner, except for her. And I remember her telling us that one of the guy looked at her and said, "Why are you not getting up and going to make dinner?" And she told him, "Well, I want to have a say in this discussion, so I want to stay." And she stood her ground and stayed. But I think this kind of goes to show the gender expectation of, you know, yeah, well, it's dinner time. Why are you sitting down with us? Like, you need to get up and go make dinner. And I think that's, but yeah, I just wanted to share that little story. So
Yeah.
Chimila, the last question I have is, if you could give one advice to all the Tibetan girls, what would that be?
That's a hard one. So I honestly don't believe in giving sort of one size fit all advice, type of advice to folks, because of the fact that I truly believe in the power of context, right? We have to contextualize everything in order to really give advice. So it's hard for me to give kind of like general advice, but I would say something that has sort of worked for me is to always sort of speak up for the right things. And Yeah, so always speak up for the right things and be upstanders for those who have been oppressed for centuries. And that includes people of color, that includes women, that includes immigrant groups, right? And I would say do your homework, work hard, and then follow your intuition, right? Oftentimes we tend to let someone else make decisions for ourselves or dictate our lives. I would say that don't let anybody decide your life for you, right? Find your own voice and your own agency, even if it means that you will have to disrupt the status quo. Because if you do that, you're not going to live with regrets, right? But if you just listen to someone just because you respect that person, you might end up living with regrets. So I think it's really important to be independent thinkers and find your own inner voice and follow that intuition.
That's a really great advice. So this is it for our podcast. Thank you so much, Chimila, for your time. I always learn so much from you, and no matter how many times I talk to you, I get inspired by you all the time. And I hope our viewers get the same out of this podcast. So thank you, Chimila.
Thank you, Rinzin.